And now to introduce Kiara. Kiara graduated from Davidson College in 2011. She went on to a special profit program for nonprofit executives at Georgetown University, where she received a certificate. And then she began working in the nonprofit sector, a job in Washington. Then she worked with the Ball Foundation in Jacksonville, Florida. But she came here to EJI, where she's been working community education and outreach for a number of years now, so that she has been involved herself with the development of the EJI Museum and the memorial. So she's here to talk about the process of building these two institutions. And Kiara, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I want to begin by apologizing for not being with you all for the duration of the symposium. After seeing the speakers and the topics, it broke my heart to know that I would have to be in other places. And so I'm eager to learn from you all about the conversation that you've been having, and hopeful that this conversation about the Equal Justice Initiative, the Legacy Museum, and the National Memorial can build on that dialogue and hopefully continue well past this afternoon's conversation. I do want to bring greetings on behalf of our director, Brian Stevenson, and the entire team at EJI. We really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this conversation. And this afternoon, I hope to share a little bit more about our efforts and the ways in which we believe that art has and does help to advance truth and justice. And in this conversation this afternoon, I'm really going to try to aim to show you how we have used and incorporated artists and the work of art to help to advance our basic core mission and values around achieving equity and justice for some of the most vulnerable populations in our country. So, to begin, I'd like to share a little background information about the Equal Justice Initiative for those of you who may be a little bit less familiar with us. We were founded in the late 1980s by Brian Stevenson, and we are a nonprofit human rights organization that provides legal representation to people who have been illegally convicted, unfairly sentenced, or abused in state jails and prisons. We challenge the death penalty and excessive punishment, and we provide reentry assistance to formerly incarcerated people. When we started the organization, or when they, I should say, started the organization in the late 1980s, about a quarter of all of the executions in the country were happening in the state of Alabama. And EJI continues to provide direct legal representation to over 100 condemned men and women who are on Alabama's death row. We also provide assistance, consulting, and case management to dozens of death row prisoners in the state who have pro bono assistance from some firms in the Northeast or the Midwest. For those of you who may have read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, it focuses on the experience of an African-American man named Walter McMillan, who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to be executed in Alabama. And he spent 6 years on death row before Brian and the team were able to secure his release. In this picture, that is Herbert Richardson. Mr. Richardson was executed in 1989, despite the state of Alabama's failure to provide him with timely and effective legal assistance. And at the time of his execution, as you can see in this image, we were still using electrocution as the mode of killing. EJI's work has also expanded to representing children, primarily children who have been prosecuted as adults in our criminal justice system. For those of you who work with young people or who even just know young people, we understand that the conditions of our nation are such that there are thousands of young children who are imperiled by abuse, neglect, and domestic and community violence and poverty. And without effective intervention and help, these children suffer, they struggle, and they sometimes fall into despair and hopelessness. And some of these young teenagers, adolescents, cannot manage the emotional, social, and psychological challenges of adolescence. And I would argue that some adults can't manage those things as well. And sometimes they engage in destructive and violent behavior. And sadly, instead of having effective responses to provide resources to help them with this management, we have ignored it, and this dysfunction has created a whole host of challenges for children and has subjected them to further victimization and abuse in the adult criminal justice system. So today, it is true that thousands of children have been sentenced as adults and sent to adult prisons. On any given day in this country, there are about 10,000 children who are housed in these adult facilities where we know they are much more likely to be victims of abuse and to try to harm themselves. Some 3,000 children have been sentenced to die in prison or a life without parole sentence. Joe Sullivan, in that top right photo, was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for a non-homicide that he was convicted of at the age of 13 that we do not believe he committed. EJI took his case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it resulted in a ban on life without parole sentences for children convicted of non-homicide sentences. And in 2018, Mr. Sullivan was released, and that was after spending 25 years incarcerated in the state of Florida. The U.S. Supreme Court has also banned mandatory life without parole sentences for children, recognizing that children's diminished culpability and heightened capacity for change. We have to believe in the possibility of change. EJI is also actively pursuing relief from America's tragic over-incarceration, which has made us the most punitive nation on earth. With over 2 million people in jails and prisons in America, conditions of confinement in many states, including Alabama, have become abusive, violent, dangerous, and unconstitutional. EJI challenges these inhumane prison conditions and works to obtain parole for people who have been incarcerated sometimes for decades, to educate policymakers about best practices and the need for sentencing reform and alternatives to incarceration, and we provide reentry services to our clients coming out of prison by providing a range of support. So for someone like Joe Sullivan, who was incarcerated at the age of 13, our reentry services look like everything from teaching him about technology and managing his own money to how to cook for himself. There's just a dearth of information that they don't have access to when you are essentially reared in prison. And all of this work has provided a firsthand view of the many ways our nation's current era of mass incarceration is deeply rooted in the American history of racial injustice and has inspired us to launch a project documenting and memorializing the eras of enslavement, racial terror, lynching, and segregation. With this proximity that our legal work has provided us, we recognize that we have to commit ourselves to an era of truth and justice if we are to repair and to restore our nation from its long history of racial injustice. And in order to understand and really to fully appreciate the ways that the current discriminatory policies and systems impact our society, we have to unpack and confront our history of racial inequality. This history is embedded in the very fabric of our nation and emphasizes the ways that we use the narrative and the myth of racial difference to justify behaviors that would otherwise be unjustifiable. It provided permission to not only demonize, but to strip the humanity from another community. And we've used that framework to devastate Native and indigenous populations that were on this land, and then that ideology was deepened and evolved into the rationale for the hereditary system of chattel slavery in this nation. At EJI, we believe that telling the truth is important. We believe that telling the truth about the slave trade, racial terror, and lynching, Jim Crow segregation, and mass incarceration is critical to overcoming the division and conflict that have grown from centuries of denial and avoidance. And we are committed to engaging communities in honest reflection that can help our nation respond more effectively to the legacies of racial inequality. Almost a decade ago, our staff began investigating thousands of racial terror lynchings in the American South, many of which had never been documented. We were interested not only in lynching incidents, but in understanding the terror and trauma this sanctioned violence against the Black community created, and to understand what that meant for our entire nation, and with the fact that 6 million Black people fled this region as refugees and exiles as a result of these racial terror lynchings. The research that we did ultimately produced Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror, which we released in February of 2015, and it documented thousands of these racial terror lynchings in the states of the former Confederacy and Kentucky. Since that time, we've also continued our research and have supplemented that with an additional 400 documented lynchings in states outside of that region. And you can see that on the map and in the website. Many communities where lynchings took place have erected monuments recognizing the Civil War, the Confederacy, and white Southerners' violent retaking of local power after Reconstruction. But very few monuments or memorials address the history and legacy of lynching, and most victims of lynching have never been publicly acknowledged. And as it relates to the Civil War, we know that the North, or the Union, won the war, but we would argue that the South won the narrative war, won control of how we think and remember what happened. And so we, as a community, need to be very intentional in creating opportunities for communities to work together to offer a more truthful, comprehensive understanding of our history and its legacies that shape our contemporary lives. We believe that understanding this history, these eras, is critical if we are to confront and to repair the harm that has been done. So to do this, we have created some projects that hopefully create opportunities for communities to get involved. One of the things that we know is that the public narrative a nation creates about what is important is reflected in its memorials and monuments. And so if these memorials and monuments are a reflection of our values, we want to ask ourselves, what are they saying? And so our Community Remembrance Project partners with community groups to memorialize documented victims of violence throughout history and foster meaningful dialogue about race and justice today. The Community Soil Collection Project, which is depicted in this image, gathered soil at lynching sites for display in really haunting exhibits that bear the names of the victims. The Historical Marker Project erects narrative markers in public locations describing the devastating violence today widely unknown that once took place in these locations. These projects and the other engagement efforts that community groups develop center the African American experience of racial injustice and hopefully empower African American community members who have directly borne this trauma and invite the entire community to use truth to give voice to those experiences and expose those legacies. The Community Soil Collection Projects, and this is a picture from inside the Legacy Museum, have proved to be incredibly impactful to those who have participated, and community partners who have completed soil collections continually express that deep and meaningful emotional impact of these experiences. One of the ways in which our director, Brian Stevenson, describes the purpose and the connection to the soil is described in these words. He says that in the soil, there is the sweat of the enslaved. In the soil, there is the blood of victims of racial violence and lynching. There are the tears in the soil from all those who labored under the indignation and humiliation of segregation. But in the soil, there is also the opportunity for new life, a chance to grow something hopeful and healing for the future. And so when we look at the soil collection exhibit together and you see the different shades of brown, it does condemn the entire community about what has happened, but it also represents an opportunity to bravely stand in truth about what has happened. And so these jars of soil collected by community members are on exhibit in the museum here in Montgomery at the Peace and Justice Center, but there are also communities who are choosing to create local exhibits, and we're seeing this happen throughout the country where people are at the local level are inviting people in parts of Georgia and Missouri and Florida to come and to learn about that narrative that's happening right there in their own communities. And that's also reflected in the ways in which we're hoping to change the iconography of our community through the Historical Marker Project. And when we put the historical markers up, we also do an essay contest for high school students because we want this to be an intergenerational conversation that invites young people to think about and to reflect about how this history is relevant to their lives. And also to show them that something good and positive can come from engaging in the difficult work of truth-telling as well. So in April of 2018, we opened 2 new immersive sites to build on creating these tangible opportunities for communities. The first is the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, and it's located on the site of a former warehouse where Black people were enslaved in Montgomery. And the museum is distinct from some other museums and cultural sites in the nation in that we think of it as a narrative museum. And it's a museum that uses interactive media, sculpture, videography, and exhibits to immerse visitors in the sights and sounds of the domestic slave trade, racial terrorism, Jim Crow segregation, and the world's largest prison system. And it operates as both a physical site, but also an outreach program. And it's designed as an engine for education and also to affirm the lived experience of so many people in our communities. And it is our hope that together these things will create an opportunity for the content and the visitors who engage with the content to transform it from just a physical space, but into a space of truth and healing. So although we walk into that space understanding that it's a historical place of trauma, we hope that people emerge with an understanding of the possibilities of what can occur when we confront our history in very meaningful ways. The Titus Kafar doubt sculpture that's in the slavery exhibit hopefully invites visitors to engage with the humanity of the individual and to wonder about the anguish depicted. Throughout the exhibit about the domestic slave trade and the trafficking of people in this region, we wanted to create multiple entry points for visitors to engage with the humanity of people who endured this brutal institution. And when Titus Kafar speaks about his approach to all of his artwork, he names the ways that he hopes people who engage with his art are motivated to shift their gaze, to widen their perspective, and to consider the painful parts of our history from the perspective of people who have been traditionally erased in silence. I was speaking to a group of young people earlier this week, and one of the questions they asked was about the humanity of people who had been enslaved, the humanity of people who had been lynched, the humanity of people who had been legally prevented from accessing public spaces. And she asked me if EJI felt like we were trying to restore the humanity of those people. And I don't think that we are aiming to restore humanity. I think we are aiming to affirm the humanity of these people and to argue that their humanity, although devalued and neglected and abused, isn't something that can be taken away, and that hopefully in these spaces we have an opportunity to elevate that consciousness and to change the perspective of how we think about these issues. One of the most heartbreaking components of this exhibit for me are the newspaper articles that after emancipation, after the end of the war, that people placed using the little coins that they had in search of their loved ones. One of those newspaper articles was printed in a paper where I grew up in Mississippi. And so I hearken back to this idea that those familial ties, that human experience of being separated from your loved ones, is something that we also have to be reckoning with as we think about this history. The museum also includes interactive exhibits about our lynching research. This is the place that if you are interested in knowing more about the research and documentation efforts that EJI has engaged in, that you can access that information. The segregation forever signs and statutes from the era of racial segregation are displayed to help visitors understand the magnitude of this system and the ways in which it was just really sinister. And it was every day. It was a daily humiliation, and it was codified and made the law of the land. And it's important that we recognize the extent to which the state and federal law upheld this system. In front of this exhibit is a table of Supreme Court cases, because we think it's really important for us to understand the ways in which the systems were at play, in addition to the interpersonal ways in which this violence was carried out. The exhibit also includes the individual narratives from incarcerated men and women and children, as well as an original film about the conditions of confinement in Alabama, as well as an opportunity to listen to the stories of our formerly incarcerated clients. One of the things that we recognized we had to do with the museum was to both educate people about these issues, but also to have a space that people who experience these scenarios could say that it was true to form. And so when you sit in this visitor's booth, you are also confronted with all these rules and regulations about how to engage with the person that you're trying to visit. And when you read the letters from actual people who've written to us, we hope that it opens a window into understanding, again, the humanity of the people who are often at the objects of this oppressive system. And one of the last pieces that visitors engage with before they leave the museum is this bronze sculpture by Sanford Biggers titled "Bam" for Michael Brown. It's a powerful piece that invites the viewer to engage with the pain, as well as the juxtaposition of the size and the use of the historical, noble and weighty medium of bronze. For Biggers, this process bestows honor to the damaged figure, allowing it to become a power object that, along with the memory of the victim, Michael Brown, is worthy of veneration and a stark reminder of the work that needs to be done to fight injustice. So just as we want people to leave the museum with the hope and a commitment to fighting against these injustices, we also want them to leave with an understanding that this is a continued struggle and the reality of the situation isn't removed from our daily lives. So the entire area, there's a piece done by Glenn Ligon that takes Brian Stevenson's signature with hope, and that's right next to this Sanford Biggers piece. And at the same time that we want people to understand the historical context, we also want them to realize that this is something that is still happening in our daily lives. So we want you to emerge from this place with a sense of hope, but a sense of reality of what is at play and what is at stake if we do not engage. The second space that we opened in April of 2018, which, as an aside, that was a very crazy week. Is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And EJI created the memorial as a space for everyone to confront our nation's history of racial inequality with the hope that a future of peace and justice can be achieved. So really the title of the memorial is aspirational. The memorial is dedicated to educating visitors about how 2 centuries of enslavement of Black people evolved into decades of terror and violence following the collapse of Reconstruction. It details the violence and terror that forced African Americans to flee and the continuing legacy of that terror through today. When you first enter, one of the first pieces that you see is this piece by Kwame Akoto Bamfu. And these 6 figures represent one of the few sculptures of slavery in America that attempts to present both the brutality of that institution, but also the humanity of the enslaved. Mr. Akoto Bamfu calls his sculpture Ninchinchem, and it's an African proverb that means resistance, opposition to oppression, and brutality. And so the sculpture is about the transatlantic slave trade, and depicting people searching for humanity in a strange and hostile land. And what I love about this piece, and I won't try to give you the explanation that Mr. Akoto Bamfu gives, but there is a story, there is a narrative for each individual. There is a sense of resistance, there is a sense of pain, there is a sense of somebody, and we wanted people to encounter that sculpture before entering the memorial that focuses on the lynching victims, because we needed to have context for understanding how we could carry out such brutal violence, but you couldn't do that devoid of this history of devaluing Black lives. And so we were really grateful for the opportunity to work with Mr. Akoto Bamfu, and we'll be doing some more projects with him over the next few months that you'll see here in Montgomery. But that is the tone that we wanted to set for the experience of engaging with the content in the memorial. And so as you make your way up the path and you enter the memorial square, you enter the first corridor, and the monuments are at eye level. You can touch them, you can feel them. The surface is rough, it's not smooth, and they are not all the same. The color isn't all the same, and the material is Corten steel, which, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, it starts off like you think of all steel, silver. But over time, it oxidizes and it turns into these brownish, reddish colors. And it gives almost the impression of the human body. And when you look at the ways in which the rust has stained those monuments, It looks battered. It maybe even looks bloodied. It looks bruised. And that's the type of content that we wanted people to engage with as they navigated that space. And so on every monument, there are the names that we've been able to document of racial terror lynching victims. On some monuments, there are 1 or 2 or 3 names. On other monuments, there are dozens of names. And each monument is a response to each county, independent city, or parish where we've been able to document these lynchings. The word unknown appears on several of the monuments because in these instances, the lynching victims were never named by the local press or the historical documentation that we were able to use. And since there was no documentation of their names, we know that the lynching occurred, but we don't know their names, and so we wanted to still capture that violence. The first corridor also introduces this narrative about lynching in America with the hope that visitors engage with those names and those dates to see the humanity that these were people. And there aren't really any other spaces in our country where you can go and engage and reflect and learn about these people. For many Americans, it's hard to name a lynching victim. And if you can name one, it's often someone that's not from that community. And so not enough of us understand what the local narrative of the places where we grew up, where we work, where we play, where we pray, what that legacy has meant. And so it's our hope that when you can't avoid the monuments in that first corridor, that it creates that immersive experience of having to confront that pain. In the second corridor, the floor begins to drop, and then you see these large rectangular boxes underneath the monuments. Some of that design is for ADA compliance. Some of it is also to sort of mark the place where the monument would have been if it was still flush with the ground. But eventually, as you get to the end of that second corridor, the monuments are completely suspended above your head. And now you have to look up to see them. There's a physical alteration in your engagement with the monuments that has to occur. And by the time you get to the third corridor, as depicted in this image, the monuments are lifted up so high that now you can read the bottom of it and you have to look up to read these names. And the density of the monuments is intensified. And so now you recognize that hopefully you're standing under the history and the legacy of this violence. And when we think about the image that's most commonly associated with lynching, of strange fruit, of hanging bodies, the monuments that are hanging above evoke some of that visual. But I think there's also a sense of reverence that you have to give because you now have to look up in order to engage with it, with the content. But in this space, the other thing that this evokes is that the public nature of the violence. So there is a process by which this violence could have been carried out and under the cloak of darkness and secrecy, where no one would have known. They could have literally buried the bodies. But instead, to really carry out and to emphasize the trauma and the pain, they decided to often leave these bodies on display. It's not uncommon to read narratives where people were lynched and their bodies were dragged through the African American community. It's not uncommon to read these narratives and to find out that people were left on display in front of the courthouse or in front of the jail, often with notes that were threats to anybody who would try to remove them, often with threats made to law enforcement about what would happen to them if they tried to remove them. And so when you are in this third corridor and you're looking at these monuments, all of that we hope is at play. Also in this area are these epitaphs where we've prepared just brief information from the research that our team has done about some of the reasons given for these lynchings. I'll just read a couple. So one of them says, Charlotte Harris was lynched in Rockingham County, Virginia in 1878 after a white man's barn burned down. Arthur Jordan was lynched in Warrenton, Virginia in 1880 for eloping with a white woman. About 25% of the lynchings that we document have to deal with this fear that black men would violate the sanctity and purity of white womanhood, from everything from startling white women to passing a note to a white woman to sometimes being accused of actual violence. 7 black people were lynched near Screamer, Alabama in 1888 for drinking from a white man's well. So once you end that corridor, the monuments are completely suspended above, and there is a row of benches at that end. And that's where we hope people who need time to sit and to process and to reflect can do so. And as they're sitting there reflecting, we wanted them to be confronted with sort of this purpose for the memorial, which reads, "For the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires great bravery. And with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. And with faith, because we shall overcome." And in this last corridor of the memorial, there's also this wall with water running down it. And we know that water can be very healing and tranquil, and we wanted it to be a part of this opportunity to be soothing and comforting. But on that wall are also the words, "Thousands of African Americans are unknown victims of racial terror lynchings whose deaths cannot be documented, many whose names will never be known, and they are all honored here." So there's another category of unknown lynchings. These are the stories that we know exist, but don't have any historical record. Sometimes these are passed down in oral history narratives, sometimes not. But we wanted people to recognize that the documented racial terror lynchings, this over 4,400 number that exists for this time period at the memorial, is not the totality of the violence. And we can truly never, ever know what the actual number is, but in this space that we've created, all are honored, all are remembered, and that's what the hope of that piece. As you leave the memorial, you are encountering a couple more sculptures that harken back to this idea of slavery evolved. And so this is a piece titled "Guided by Justice" by the sculptor Dana King. And it's a sculpture dedicated to the women who made the Montgomery bus boycott possible. Those of you in this room are probably largely familiar with that boycott, but we wanted people who came to the memorial to understand the activism, the advocacy, and the literally backbreaking work of the women who made that movement possible. It's hard to see in these pictures, but there's also a reflection garden in this area that's named for Ida B. Wells, because as we think about this work of documenting lynchings and doing this work of bringing it into the public discourse, we recognize that we light our torches from her fire and the work that she did in her life to document and to tell these stories and to make sure that we couldn't turn away and couldn't forget. In the Memorial Square, the monuments are all hanging vertically. They are suspended from the roof. They face you. In the Monument Park, which this picture depicts, they are lying horizontally. They almost present like tombs. And the hundreds of brown 6-foot monuments with the same names that are in the Memorial Square are located in this Monument Park. And it's in this park that oftentimes people will go to find a specific state or a county or a name because it's just a little bit easier to access. But all of these monuments are duplicates of the ones in the Memorial Square. And over time, these are the monuments that we hope to complement some of the other work with the Community Remembrance Project of soil collection, of historical marker, and to be placed in communities. And with this work, we hope to unearth the truth of our past and really to begin to encourage us as a nation to confront it more honestly. Because one of the things that we wholeheartedly believe at EJI is that truth and reconciliation, truth and repair, truth and justice, truth and healing, none of that can happen without the truth. It has to be sequential. And it's impossible for us to get to these goals if we don't do the difficult, messy work of truth-telling. And so all of these projects, including the placement of these monuments is aimed at creating tangible opportunities for truth-telling in very public, hopefully inviting ways. And one of the last pieces of art that visitors see at the National Memorial is this sculpture by the award-winning artist Hank Willis Thomas. And we have been fortunate to do quite a few projects with Mr. Thomas. And the title of this sculpture is Raise Up. And what we know to be true is that Black and brown people in this country often are presumed dangerous and guilty when they have done nothing wrong. Our history of racial inequality has created conscious and unconscious bias that has resulted in racial discrimination against people of color by law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And so police shootings of unarmed men, women, and children, racially biased and excessive sentencing of people convicted of crimes, and abusive prison conditions make mass incarceration a dominant issue for the poor and people of color. And so similar to the museum, we wanted to create an opportunity for people to leave this site committed to action, but with a profound and explicit understanding that these issues are also still happening and plaguing our communities today. We understand the power of having facts. I work for a host of lawyers who have to do briefs and have evidence and have their arguments. But one of the things that we know to be persuasive is when you can create an opportunity for people to be connected to stories, to be connected to individuals, to be connected in ways that allow for empathy to blossom. And the use of art, whether it be sculpture or painting or song or dance or anything else, allows us to bridge some of those gaps to hopefully get us closer to being able to have conversations about meaningful reform so that the future is brighter, is more just, it's more equitable for our children. And we can start doing that today. So thank you all, and I think we have time for questions. Yep.
I don't want my comments to. Okay, I don't want my comments to be taken out of context. In 1968, I spent 3 weeks on a senatorial campaign for Maynard Jackson. He later became the first black mayor of Atlanta. And also, I worked for Bill Baxley when he hired the first black attorneys to work for the state of Alabama. But it seems like you're not telling the complete story. The welfare system that was created out of the Great Society programs has led to over 70% of all black children being born out of wedlock. We've got 30%. We've got 30% of all white children born out of wedlock. My question is, why aren't you telling about what welfare is doing to the black community? Because the mass incarceration is a result of that welfare system that's taken the black father out of the black community. That's part of the story that you're not telling. Do you have any comment about the current welfare system? It's that offers a teenage child an apartment, a check, food stamps, health care.
Oh, hey, baby. Thank you for your question. It's not surprising that that myth of sort of the trope and the stereotype of the welfare queens and the devaluing and the breaking down of the black family as a result of that institution is something that people still harbor and still hearken onto. What we are arguing when you visit the museum, which I highly encourage, as well as a wealth of resources and books there, is that there are systems of injustice and discrimination that have been fueled oftentimes by conservative and anti-black and anti-poverty politicians that were the foundation and the bedrock for a lot of the continued discrepancies that we see with mass incarceration and the ways in which communities are policed. I will look forward to any other question at this time.
I'll go quick. It's closest.
Hi, thank you. I'm the Reverend Dr. E.K. Dauphin. We give thanks and honor for the work that you did and for EJI. The Montgomery Advertiser published an op-ed piece I did about the sculpture that is at the entry. Did you have an opportunity to see it? I'd like to send you a copy if you didn't. One thing that, it was so comprehensive, everything that you did, it was so moving. I went with my high school friend, and it moved us both, and we needed those benches at the end to sit down. I wanted to also note that one thing that I don't know how it could be put into this exquisite project that you've done at both the sites, but the sexual terrorism against black women was horrific. And one thing we see right in the beginning, you know, there was a special chamber in the slave ships, in the transatlantic slave ships, where women were put underneath the quarters of the, you know, and I think this, you have, oh, there's so much more that I know you couldn't cover, right, that you have about the slave ships on the, in the memorial, but you know that they were raped on the way coming over because they became, you know, African-American human beings were used as money, and the slave breeding industry was also, you know, such a huge part of building the wealth of America. And so one thing that I would like to know is what might you do in the future, or any comments you have about the sexual terrorism of African-American women from, you know, the beginning all through the future with the mass incarceration, even, and knowing that, you know, among women, black women are the largest group of incarcerated women. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so the museum doesn't posit to be sort of the end-all be-all, but we are hoping to be able to be a window into further engagement, and our reports and other public education materials hope to deepen some of that engagement. So we have written about, in our lynching report, in our report about slavery, even in our History of Racial Injustice calendar, profiling and highlighting those narratives, both historical assault and abuse, but also the ways in which we see that abuse happening to women today. We were really involved with the cases at Tutwiler where women were being sexually assaulted and abused by correctional staff there. And so that it is our hope that that is sort of the totality of the conversation, but that the museum can be almost the gateway for more engagement and for further and deeper scholarship. One of the reasons why our bookshop and gift store is both, you know, souvenirs I was there, but it also is a library that we hope people will engage with and really consider the works that are there. And in the museum, there are those panels at the very back of each exhibit that have just shorter essays, and over time we are rotating, changing, deepening, all across the board. So that, I definitely think that is something that we want people to understand, is almost the unique ways in which women were harmed throughout these systems of abuse and violence.
Regarding the National Memorial, can you speak to the process of the design of the entire site? And like who was involved, and if there were other proposals as to how the site should be configured? What were the thoughts that elevated this design to be the one chosen?
So one of the things that I think is important to realize is that the point from, not the point from the research into the creation of the sites, but the point from the idea of creating physical spaces to the opening of the sites was relatively short. The full report came out in 2015 and the sites opened in April of 2018. There are projects that take decades. So what happened is that as we were doing this research, as we were having these conversations and looking at the public landscape and just operating in Alabama, we recognized that there seemed to be some absence and started having internal conversations and dialogues about what would it look like to create a space that talked about the history of lynching, that talked about creating these points of reflection. And so as we were in those internal conversations, we were put in touch with Mass Design Group, which is a nonprofit architectural firm out of Boston, who ultimately was our primary design partner for the memorial. In those conversations, what we appreciated hearing from them more than just the design idea was their approach and strategy to thinking about the substantive narrative. And they were really good about listening to us, and that we didn't want this to be just a cool architecture piece. We wanted it to be something that evoked the truth of the experience of the research that we were trying to do and amplified that space. And so once we began those conversations with them, that's really how they became our prominent partner. Most of their work before working with EJI was in Africa, building hospitals. They helped with the Genocide Memorial in Rwanda. And so this was really their first US-based project. And so they were just a good partner for someone who was interested in doing something a little bit different than what most other cultural museum architecture firms were interested in trying to explore, and doing so with people who were like, we don't have the money yet, but we're good for it. And then as we started to design and we were thinking about this overarching narrative, it's when we began to pull in these other artists like Kwame, like Dana King, like Hank Willis Thomas, and so many others that have really added to the fullness and richness of that experience. One of the things that you all may have seen covered in the advertiser is that in early 2020, we're opening up another space that will add on to this narrative that we're talking about. It will expand our conversation about the history of racial terror violence to prior to the end of Reconstruction, as well as creating a space for people to engage with visiting exhibits, because we really think it's important that we continue to leverage the resources that we have here and the opportunity to be a catalyst for this conversation. So it wasn't a traditional process as what you would see in a lot of places around design partners and such. It really was a bunch of relational, who's listening and who hears us when we say we want to do something that's slightly different than the norm, but who can see the vision and help us implement it. I hope that answers.
Hi, thank you for all the information you've been giving us. When I went to the memorial the beginning of the year, there was a couple of points that were made. One was that there's a hope that other states would pick up the monuments from the people that were lynched in different places in the country. And there was also a question of finding the names and the people, and there were, I believe, about 300 that needed to be identified and documented. How is that process moving along?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yeah, when we opened the memorial and the museum, before the public opening, Brian took Oprah Winfrey through a walkthrough of the space just to, I think it was on 60 Minutes. And as he's talking about the site and talking about the hope for communities to claim the monuments, one of the things that she says to him off camera is, nobody's gonna claim those monuments, so I hope you have a plan B. And one of the things that we realized is that when we put that invitation out, we were, I think, pleasantly surprised by the level of enthusiasm and engagement from individuals, from community members, from people who wanted to respond to that. We heard from over 300 communities in the first 6 months of the opening. But what we recognize, and that's one of the things about EJI when you look at the history of the organization, is that we're always learning, we're always evolving. And what we recognize is that this was an opportunity to really reshape and to broaden the perspective and some of the energy around what claiming the monument meant. And so some people, I think, were in line with what we had hoped the monument claiming would be, and others were interested in using it as a political chip, being able to say, I'm the mayor or the city council person who got this thing about racial justice to our community, so I'm good to do whatever I want for like the next 30 years. And others wanted to do as individual. They were like, I can put it in my front yard. And again, we appreciated the enthusiasm, but it was a little bit too narrow of what we were hoping to see as a broader community dialogue, a catalyst for true conversation about this history that focuses on the history of racial terror lynching, but also looks back to slavery, that talks about the Jim Crow segregation, that unpacks some of these contemporary challenges that are literally plaguing our communities today, and to do so in a way that look differently than sometimes we typically have those conversations, if we have them at all. So we wanted people to not only do so with their churches, with their neighborhoods. We wanted them to think about who are the people that I don't usually sit around the table with, but we are all sort of in this together because we all live in this community. And that's really what has given more fuel to some of the emphasis that we've been placing on some of the reasons why I think Brian Stevenson has agreed to do some of these projects like the HBO documentary or the feature film for Just Mercy is to provide tools so that communities can gather around them, not unlike this symposium where you're having a conversation through a particular lens, but doing so with people from different organizations, different political beliefs, and hopefully creating safe spaces for meaningful dialogue that can actually create some tangible change in how we advocate, how we demand things from our legislators. And that's also our hope with the soil collections and the historical markers, because so much of this historical narrative is something that we don't know or that we have been able to water down or rewrite, and we need to create space where we are no longer saying that that is acceptable. And so our hope is that some of that sort of ongoing commitment can happen and be institutionalized into the local infrastructure before communities start claiming their monuments. Because for a lot of places, just having that monument is not going to be enough. There has to be a lot more community dialogue happening so that when the monument comes, it is a reminder of that community's commitment to doing this work, and that when you go to that community, you know that they are committed to doing justice work. And you can hold them accountable because they have that monument and they have said that they are committed to doing these issues. If we just let the monuments go to everybody who's like, we would like it, then we don't have that same, it doesn't symbolize the same amount of commitment. And to your second question about the finding additional names, one of the things we know about this research is that it will always be ongoing. And we've made a commitment since before the site's open to continuing to do it. We've been really fortunate to partner with communities who are also doing additional research on the ground, and that's allowed us to revise and correct some of our own research and documentation. Because we didn't have a agency or anyone who was tracking this lynching violence or where it was happening, there is no sort of official record. And what we're trying to do is to provide space for there to potentially be one, but it's going to have to continue to be dynamic. There are always opportunities to find local narratives, local newspaper articles, local documentation, and we want to invite community people to do that and to share that with us. And when we do have that information, we're able to update the monuments, to update our exhibits, and to talk about how dynamic this research has to be. And even as we're hearing more oral history narratives, we're able to add that into our resources as well, because it's also a huge, important part of the ways in which these communities have been silenced at the same time that they've been completely violated and abused.
All right, do one more? Yeah, let me just run to you. Don't talk yet. You know the rules.
Kiara, thank you for your talk. I want to highlight a point that you made that's, I think this is more of a comment than a question, but a really important point. As a scholar and a curator, you know, I thought I was pretty well versed on lynching. I had studied Walter White's landmark anti-lynching exhibition and even recreated part of it at the Birmingham Museum of Art, gosh, I guess about 8 years ago. We have some of those works in our permanent collection. What I did not realize and what did not hit me with full force is the enormity of the lynching crisis in the very county in which I reside, in Jefferson County, Alabama. And, you know, and that the first lynching was right across the street from the Birmingham Museum of Art in Lynn Park. It wasn't until I was at the monument, at the memorial, and it was the preview, and it was toward the end of the, you know, they were just closing the gates and everyone had to get to the main event. And I was walking through, there were very few people there, and I came across the Jefferson County marker, and it hit me with the full force because there were so many names that a smaller font had to be used. And that just, I mean, at that moment, I think I realized I don't know nearly what I think I know, and I've got a lot left to learn. So thank you for helping us learn, and thank you to EJI for all that you do.
Thank you.
One more.
I want to commend you as well, and thank you. I just saw the museum. The museum is impressive, and your issue about outreach and this young man saying that the story is not complete. He's right, because I think that more defensive white people like him are defensive because they have family members who were lynchers, and it's from these people that we need to have names and we need to have their stories, and then we'll have a complete package. Thank you.
Speakers, participants, everyone, thank you. Thank you for your grace and for all that you have shared with us. And Ed, again, thank you for thinking of this symposium, for leading the museum while we waited for the wonderful Angie, and the joy with which you did both. Go forth and revel in the great art of Alabama and all that there is left to do.